Go.
Hi, I'm Peter Husey, and I want to welcome you to this, our 20th Nuclear Triad event titled Second to None, Working Together to Modernize America's Nuclear Deterrent. I'm Peter Husey, and I'm Director of Strategic Deterrent Studies at the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies and President and CEO of my own consulting company, Geostrategic Analysis in Potomac, Maryland. I am happy to co-host this virtual symposium with the great people of the Cyber Innovation Center and Louisiana Tech Research Institute in Louisiana. Originally, we planned a live conference in Bossier City, Louisiana. However, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we've gone virtual, although a number of our speakers on the 10th of December will be live. I am honored today to have a good friend and a nuclear colleague, the Honorable Ron Lehman II. He is one of the nation's top experts on arms control. He's a frequent speaker on my Capitol Hill Breakfast Series on nuclear deterrence and missile defense. He's counselor to the director of Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. And before that, for many years, he was the director of the Center for Global Security Research at Lawrence Livermore. He has served in the U.S. Department of Defense as Assistant Secretary for International Security Policy. He served in the State Department as ambassador and U.S. negotiator on strategic offensive arms, or START 1, with the Soviet Union, and in Russia, and then in the White House as Deputy Assistant to the President of the United States for National Security Affairs. He was also Director of the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency from 1989 to 1993, when START 1, START 2, and the Chemical Weapons Convention, Conventional Weapons Forces in Europe, Open Skies, and other historic arms control agreements were concluded. Today, he will be talking on the topic of stability, transparency, and risk, arms control challenges for a new era. And his remarks are his own, and they're not representative of any organization with which he is either affiliated or associated. Mr. Ambassador, it's an honor to have you here. Ron, please.
Well, Peter, I'm really pleased to be joining you.
Thank you, sir. Go ahead.
I understood that you wanted to talk about a number of questions related to arms control and the Triad. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Many people don't realize that all of the bilateral strategic nuclear arms agreements were really designed around the Triad to sustain the diversity that the Triad provides. And that was to reinforce the extra crisis stability that the Triad brings. A few examples might be useful. People forget that the SALT 1 agreement did not include bombers at all. It only focused on submarines and the bases and the launchers for long-range ballistic missiles, meaning ICBMs and SLBMs. The bombers were not included because they were seen as less threatening, more stabilizing. They had conventional missions and they were had lower alert rates. The SALT 2 agreement did include bombers under delivery vehicle limits, but the tightest limits were really on the fast flyers, particularly MIRVed ICBMs and SLBMs. The START 1 was famous for beginning to get a handle around accountable warheads, but the tightest limits were not on total warheads, but rather on, in particular, the fast-flying ballistic missiles, ICBMs and SLBMs, and also the issue of the highly MIRVed large ICBMs. And so the emphasis again was on keeping room for the Triad and protecting the slow flying, lower alert rate, dual capable aircraft. START 2 is interesting in that it actually had sublimits. So no more than half of the total number of warheads could be on SLBMs. And the number on ICBMs was also de facto going to be even smaller than that because of the ban on MIRVed ICBMs. Interestingly enough, New START picked up a provision of the original START 1 negotiations. Indeed, it was a position that the U.S. had pushed. And in New START, they got the bomber discount rule, which counts each bomber as one weapon in the weapons account, no matter how many outcomes or bombs it carries. This was designed, again, to preserve the flexibility of the triad. You might ask, well, why is arms control doing that? And I think there are many goals for arms control, but of course, one of the most important one is to deal with our security and dealing with, in particular, with things like crisis stability. Arms control should be seen as a tool of your national security strategy. It's not a new idea. If you read Sun Tzu and the Art of War, he says, in essence, the good general builds up his own strength, but the great general finds ways to reduce the threat and even, if possible, avoid battle. Arms control can help us with that, but it only can help us when it works from a sound foundation. And in the strategic nuclear area, that sound foundation has always come from maintaining the diversity of the triad. It's important to understand that in order to understand how arms control either makes us more or less safe. Each of the legs of the triad has its own strengths and its own weaknesses. So bombers are particularly good for signaling. They're slow flyers. They're not particularly good for preemption. On the other hand, they do face defenses. They do have low alert rates. The demerved ICBM provides a really solid foundation for force exchange stability, because to attack an individual silo may require even more warheads, and certainly the whole force requires a large attack of the sort that is not attractive to the other side. So even though individual silos can be attacked, the force itself is highly stabilizing. And likewise, the submarines, certainly those that are on station at sea, are currently highly survivable. And we need to keep it that way, even in the face of many of the changes in technology that are emerging. Having said that, the bigger problem is that not only are submarines very expensive, but most of them are routinely not at sea. And when you get down to lower numbers, the number at sea is very small. And we had a few years ago an incident in which the single British nuclear SOBM submarine, SSBN, at sea collided with the only French one at sea. And one could imagine, if that had been a catastrophic accident, what the impact would have been, not only on two different independent nuclear deterrents, but what the implications would have been for US operations. And so each has real strengths and each has real weaknesses. The diversity is really very useful. In a sense, the better way to think about it is not as hedging, or although we are compensating for weaknesses and exploiting strengths, but really to look at it as kind of synergism, making the total deterrent be greater than the sum of the parts. But there's another aspect that plays heavily in our arms control calculations, and that is that a diverse deterrent really complicates the plans of anyone who wants to attack. And let me try to simplify this. Suppose you're playing the game rock, paper, scissors, a triad. Obviously, the odds of winning the game on any given play are fairly low. But if you only had to deal with, say, scissors and paper, your odds go up. And if all you have to deal with is scissors, it's very easy to figure out a strategy to win the game every time. Now, I'm one who argues that the the value of the triad is in the diversity and the synergism and the way it complicates any attack planning. But it's not a holy trinity. In fact, I would argue that what we really have is a quadrad or a quintad, and each leg is essential. That because I would add the dual capable aircraft in Europe, and I would add also the NC3 command control communications. And so I don't know how many of you watch the television show The Big Bang Theory, but in that game, they don't play rock, paper, scissors. They play a quintad, rock, paper, scissors, lizard, Spock. The analogy is a bit like a table. A three-legged table can stand, four legs are better, but if all you've got is two legs or one leg, it's not very stabilizing. And that has had a tremendous impact on all of our nuclear arms agreements. So does that help you get started, Peter?
Oh, very much so, Mr. Ambassador. Let me ask you this question. We often think of the United States nuclear deterrent for ourselves, but we have, I think Senator Kyle said, 30 allies in NATO, plus our allies in East Asia and the Pacific, whom we provide a nuclear umbrella because they don't have to then build their own nukes. To what extent is the Triad plus NC3, the nuclear command and control, as well as our warhead infrastructure, how important is that in the perception of our allies that we have their back?
Well, it's terribly important, and I would include also our ability to deploy into regions and the dual capable aircraft. In arms control, it won't surprise you that geostrategic competition has always had a more than a shadow, or it's had a really powerful influence on the negotiations. You may remember in the context of the NATO deployment of the INF missiles, we had, in essence, we deployed the Pershing II ballistic missiles and the ground-launched cruise missiles to Europe in response to the Soviet SS-20 ballistic missiles. And as you know, there was a great deal of controversy within and among the democracies of NATO over doing that. Nevertheless, we succeeded. And I remember that the thing that seemed to hold people together was the view that what the Soviets were trying to do was to decouple the United States from its allies, to isolate us. And as you may remember, there was tremendous political influence campaigns and huge sums of monies going into the West to influence that debate. And in that context, I had a conversation. It was not too long before we actually deployed the missiles into Europe. I was in Moscow meeting with a very senior Soviet official. And at one point, I raised the question of whether or not we could reach agreement. And his comment was really very interesting. What he said was, we will never, ever, ever acquiesce in the deployment of the missiles. We intend to make you pay as high a political price as we can. However, we recognize that you're going to be successful. You are going to deploy them. So who knows, maybe after you've deployed, we could reach an agreement. And interestingly enough, he continued the strategy of negotiations by saying, perhaps we could agree to a few cruise missiles in Great Britain. So again, he was still trying to keep the focus on the fast-flying Pershing IIs, not commenting on the fast-flying SS-20s, and also trying to get us off the continent, at least get us to Britain, get us onto an island. This theme that, of getting the US away from its allies and its vital interests on the periphery of Eurasia is not new. It continues today in somewhat modified form. I remember once when then Soviet Foreign Minister Shevardnadze, whom I met later when he was president of Georgia, came to Washington announcing a big 50% reduction in nuclear weapons to match the US proposal. When we got back to the negotiations in Geneva, we learned that that proposal included all of our forward-based systems and the British and French on our side, but no comparable systems on their side. And so, in essence, it gave them de facto about a third more warheads than we would be allowed. We, of course, rejected that. But many of their efforts have been designed to divide us from our allies, and they continue to try to achieve in negotiations limits on our overseas bases and our forces overseas. In that regard, it might be interesting to remember that at the famous Reykjavik summit, there was a tentative agreement to deal with the INF question with a treaty that would have said the US would withdraw its INF missiles from Europe, and the Soviets would move their SS-20s, they would reduce them, eliminate them in Europe, but they would keep them and have them east of the Urals, i.e. technically in Asia. This proposal was tentatively agreed at the highest level, but within months it was totally reversed to go for zero in Asia as well. And the reason was that the reaction of our Asian allies to the notion that it was all right to have nukes for the in the east of the Urals in Asia, but Europe, not in Europe, relegated them to sort of second-class allies. It was a very negative reaction. Moscow realized that how negative it was. They were concerned about the non-proliferation implications of outraged American allies in Asia. And as a result, that's really how we got the so-called zero option in INF. Does that have help?
Very much. I'm going to go to the third question. Some of my colleagues who think that arms control is a snare and can't really be verified, and the Russians will always cheat. Yes, the Russians cheat. Yes, it can be, the Russians can snare you into an agreement which you may not want to, like the one where the nuclear freeze is a good example in 1980 when we hadn't built anything new and they had. So I want to ask you, to what extent is verification the key issue with respect to arms control? Not arms control itself, but whether or not you can verify it and have confidence that the other guy has what he says he has. I'd like you to address that issue.
Yeah, I think verification is terribly important, but it's not widely understood. So the first thing I think that people need to understand are what are the components of verification. And often there's a tendency in certain circles, particularly in technical circles, to equate verification with monitoring. But it's more than that. And monitoring itself is not only detection, but identification and attribution. And then verification has to deal with a clear, how clear is the language? How clear can we determine what the real responsibilities are? And then if you determine that there was a responsibility and the other side is not living up to it, how do you enforce compliance? And what are your, what can you do if the other side doesn't comply? These are big issues, and it is a complex issue. But let me give you my personal view, and that is that there's too much of a tendency to say that verification is binary. Either it's verifiable or it's not, you check the box or you don't. I tend on this issue, like so many other issues, to speak a little bit of a continuum. So I think perfect verification is a null set. You're never going to have it, and there's no treaty that meets that standard. That drives me in a more controversial direction, which is some people say, well, certain treaties are just totally unverifiable. And often the example that's given is the Biological Weapons Convention. Well, my problem with that is I think that the totally unverifiable is also a null set. And using the BWC as an example, we did find the Soviet Union in violation of the BWC. It's just that we don't have high confidence that if someone is violating, that we would know. So you have a range of verification. Now, over time, different definitions of the standard for verification emerged. So, for example, it was very common at one time to say what we want is a standard of adequate verification, which means that no violation would alter the nuclear balance. The problem with the adequate verification standard was that many people think that nothing really can alter the nuclear balance. It seemed to be a very low standard, and it made it too easy to say, well, that violation doesn't really matter. So later, an effort was made to have a tighter standard, which was called effective verification. It still had some military risk components to the definition, but it also took into account how clear were the provisions, what were the mechanisms for enforcement. It was a little bit like the Lilliputians and Gulliver. There were some chains, but there were also a lot of ropes and threads to see if the giant is moving and whether or not it's moving in the wrong direction. The whole idea being to have a process in which you move in the right direction. Now, having said that, let me give an example of that I think is really worth knowing. When the Threshold Test Ban Treaty and the Peaceful Nuclear Explosions Treaty were negotiated, there was resulted a period of great uncertainty as to how verifiable they were. As a result, they languished in the Senate for years. But in the 80s, we put together a joint verification experiment in which the two sides, in what I will call a track 1/2 process, a very sensitive peer-to-peer engagement on sensitive matters at sensitive test sites, they were able to develop a verification protocol. As a result, these treaties were approved by the Senate 98-0. It was because the verification was so robust, so precise, that it was really hard to make verification or non-verifiability a big issue. It was a step-by-step process. Now, verification is in a difficult time right now. And part of this came with the end of the Cold War. With the end of the Cold War, you had a situation in which you had all of these very detailed, intrusive nuclear agreements, but you also had extensive conventional agreements and openness and transparency agreements, monitoring of military exercises, limits on conventional forces in Europe, open skies, but you had more than that. You had the end of the Warsaw Pact, the breakup of the Soviet Union. We had a lot of arms control dedicated technical verification measures that were rather expensive. And of course, we had our broader intelligence national technical means. And we were seeing the opening up of Russia and movement in a democratic direction. Today, almost all of that has disappeared. Partly it was we wanted to get out from under some of the burdens and expenses of verification, but partly we wanted to just let the political process substitute for some of the burdensome aspects of verification. But now we look back and say, well, we're probably going to need more verification, and it's going to be difficult to reestablish everything that we once achieved in this political environment. But I think if we're going to have confidence in arms control, we're going to have to raise the bar again to higher verification standards. Then there's one point I would like to add, Peter. And when we got the zero option in INF, there was an argument made that had a certain truth to it, which is zero is easier to verify than some number of whatever it is you're limiting. And there's a certain truth to that, but there's also, it's become a bit of a myth to understand. And the best way to explain it is to look at the INF violation by Russia. The issue was not that an SS-20 was found, a transporter erector launcher for an SS-20 was found. It was rather that an otherwise potentially legal cruise missile was given a range that was prohibited. And that's not a binary categorical, does it exist or does it not, is it zero or is it something kind of definition. It is much more difficult to verify. And we have to recognize that a lot of arms control is only going to be possible if you can begin to deal with some of these things that are a lot harder to verify than counting numbers of submarines or tubes on subs or holes in the ground or even delivery vehicles. I've gone on quite a bit on that one. Sorry, Peter. Any other questions?
Yeah, it was excellent. And it leads directly into the next question is, some of my colleagues think that theater nuclear weapons, what we call either low yield or particularly those we've deployed in Europe, of which we have, I think, a couple hundred on airplanes. And the Russians have, you pick a number, between 2,000 and 5,000 is what our colleague Mark Schneider says at the National Institute of Public Policy. Many people argue, well, they're for political leverage, but they're not usable and therefore don't need to be counted under quote unquote arms control. Plus, they're very difficult to verify. What's your sense as to the Senate requirement is that the next round of arms control must include theater weapons? That's in the New START Treaty instruments of ratification. What is your sense as to the military and political purposes of which Russia sees these weapons? Because they're not under control. And the question is, if they're not worth anything, why not get rid of them? But that's not where Russia is. So I would like you to kind of explore that issue.
Well, you've already said the most important thing, which is that's not where Russia is. And by the way, it's not really where we are either. There is a sense in which everyone needs to understand that nuclear weapons are different than conventional weapons, even though conventional weapons, certain types of limited nuclear use may be less destructive than what conventional weapons do or have done. But from a deterrence point of view, we all need to understand that the decision to go nuclear carries with it the whole question of escalation and all that it means. Now, in the case of so-called, so in that sense, every weapon is strategic in its signal, but no weapon is simply symbolic. They all have the potential to be used. And the question is, under what circumstances might a country decide to use them? And the answer is that given the range of differences in physical locations and characteristics of warheads, they exist in that diversity for a reason. And the reason is to be credible in the scenarios where nuclear weapons might be invoked. What is disturbing about the current Russian rhetoric is not that they have theater systems or tactical systems. It's not that they can envision escalatory scenarios in which they would want to have the right weapons for the right targets. What's disturbing is the rhetoric that threatens little countries in non-existential ways and even threatens neutral countries like Sweden in a rhetoric that makes you wonder what's going on here. But clearly, we have our weapons in Europe for support of our allies. We don't have a very large number, but their leverage is incredibly important. While some politicians say these are only political, the Russians see them as having military consequences, and that it's the military consequences that are also a very important part of the deterrent. And it's the fact that they believe that they could, if they had to, use these weapons that they think gives them leverage, that they have credible military uses that are restrained. Now, I'm often asked this question of, well, if we have smaller, more accurate, lower collateral damage weapons, doesn't that mean it's more likely we will use them? I have a somewhat different view, which is, by and large, nuclear weapons are weapons of last resort. We're not going to use them unless we've really gotten to the point where we have to use them. And if the scenario requires that we use them, we ought to have the right kind of weapon for that use. And in these nuclear scenarios at the lower end of the escalatory ladder, especially where it involves our allies and overseas, we need to have weapons that are tailored to that purpose. And that typically means greater accuracy and smaller yield. And the Russians understand that. And we need for them to understand it. We understand them. And that's how we stay safe.
Let me ask you, again, it comes to the next question, which is, I've done a number of studies, as you have seen, on, as Mark Schneider has and Jim Howe and others, given Russia has somewhat less than 600 what are called strategic nuclear delivery vehicles. That's missiles and bombers. We have the up around 690, close to the 700 limit under the New START Treaty. What Mark Schneider and others and Jim Howe have pointed out is that the Russian ability to deploy warheads, even with that limited number of SNDVs, is very high, upwards of 3,000 or 4,000. And they believe verification isn't as strong as it needs to be to determine what number do the Russians have. Others say it doesn't matter how many warheads they have, as long as you can hold at risk or target their missiles and bombers, which is what they say is deterrence. Given the arms control always has a warhead limit on it, you know, START 1, START 2, New START, Moscow, to what extent, Ron, is it important for us to have parity or second to none in warheads as well as SNDVs? Because as a number of people, I think John Harvey told me recently, we've always had arms control that said parity is an objective. We're not going to sign a deal where the Russians have dramatically more warheads than we have under an agreement, which they get 5,000 and we get like 2,000. Could you address that issue? In the sense of what it means, do warheads matter?
Yeah. As I mentioned at the very beginning, early arms control was limited by your ability to verify. And so we counted things like numbers of submarines in SALT 1 and holes in the ground. Those were easy to see and easy to count, but they were crude surrogates for trying to get a handle on the warheads. And of course, as the SALT 1 experience showed, the actual number of warheads deployed under SALT 1 was huge. And that was because of MIRVing. And so whatever the virtues of SALT 1, it did not cap, or if it capped, it capped at a hypothetically incredibly high level the number of warheads. It allowed a huge increase. So early on in the debate over SALT II and START I and START II, the movement went away from an emphasis on SNDVs, and which were seen more as symbolic, and more on trying to get a handle on warheads, which is itself not an easy thing. So SALT II tried to cap the number of warheads that could be tested on particular types of ballistic missiles. The START I tried to get an aggregate, but it was an aggregate accountable. It was basically, you count the SNDVs, you attribute a number, and that's how you do it. Over time, the accountability became a bit more sophisticated, but that's basically what we still do. Under New START, you get a bit of a sampling of warheads on delivery systems. But the idea, and this was really embodied in START II, was to de-emphasize SNDVs per se. They still have some value, limiting them, but it was really to go after the warheads. And in fact, there was a major move in START II, and we started it in START I, to move away from SNDVs as a significant category for limitation, because in START I, the SNDV limit was 1,600. At one point, the U.S. had actually proposed 900, and that was done primarily for political visibility. But over time, the decision was made to focus more on stability rather than political acceptability and low numbers, but rather focus on stability. An interesting point is that in START II, the most important number in START II isn't in START II, and it was that unimportant number in START I, because remember, START II was embedded in START I, and that's the 1,600 SNDV limit. Well, why is something that was not important in START I so important in START II? Well, the reason is that with the MIRV ban and with the provision limiting SLBM warheads to half of the total that were allowed, the only way you could reach the maximum number of warheads permitted under the treaty was to maintain a robust triad. And so it was yet another way to encourage the stability of the triad. But in the debate on New START, the Senate made it very clear that particularly since many of the scenarios that could become nuclear overseas in smaller areas involving warheads that are not captured by New START, that somewhere down the road, and I think they wanted it to be the very next agreement, you had to start dealing with the rest of these warheads. This is not an easy question. And you're right, it is tied very much to the issue of verification. So let me give you kind of a way to think about that. If you look at how anybody acquires a nuclear weapon and deploys it, you know, you get the knowledge, you get the technology, you find a way to get the material, you find the way to engineer the components, and then you put it together. And when you put it together, you are said, using the NPT definition, to have acquired a nuclear weapon. But of course, acquiring it isn't the same thing necessarily as deploying it, although maybe a terrorist could assemble on site or something. But, and then you see the development of more and more sophisticated ways to, and diverse ways for stability reasons, to deliver the systems. So non-proliferation has tended to deal with the acquisition, and arms control has tended to deal with the deployments. but both have as their goal getting a handle on actual nuclear weapons. But arms control has moved in that direction, but basically has not been able to completely get away from it being tied to delivery vehicles. And non-proliferation has basically focused primarily in the IAEA context and safeguards on the material. But the recognition that in the case of non-proliferation that controlling material alone is not enough has led to the additional protocol and the notion that more is needed. Likewise, as we've already been discussing, reducing the number of warheads on deployed systems, inevitably there are limits to what you can do until you can get a handle on the non-deployed strategic, but also the deployed and non-deployed others, including, by the way, defensive systems, because the Russians and others have warheads that go on interceptors, both ballistic missile defense and air defense. There's a whole range of uses that the United States abandoned long ago that other countries are still pursuing. So we're going to have to get a handle on that wide range of things. To give you a feel for how tough it is, let me give you a heuristic question that I once asked a large audience of nuclear experts, including people from the intel community. I simply said, when did North Korea acquire a nuclear weapon as defined by the Non-Proliferation Treaty? And one very distinguished expert who happens to be a good friend said, well, they tested it in 2006. What's the issue? And I said, well, testing is not what the NPT says acquire is. That may be proof of acquiring, but when did they actually acquire? Well, this being a knowledgeable person said, well, wait a minute. Bob Gates, when he was CIA director back in '92, said that North Korea had acquired enough material for a weapon, or two even. Well, I said, yeah, but acquiring the material is not necessarily acquiring the weapon. My point being that between 1992 and 2006, 14 years of not knowing whether they've got one gives you a feel of the kind of problem that we're having to deal with. And ultimately, it's going to require a very comprehensive, holistic approach. I don't know how to do that. I have ideas, everybody has ideas, but whether they're going to be achievable is highly questionable. Certainly not in one big step. So my recommendation is that we use a step-by-step process. One of the problems you're going to have is defining what a weapon is. And I don't mean the general definition of what is a nuclear weapon that defines kind of what's the purpose of the negotiation. We can come up with lots of good weapons definitions like that. But when you actually try to negotiate a treaty, you're going to have definitions of what are the accountable items and what are the inspectable items. And because of the differences, for example, between us and the Russians, and different even classification guidelines, this is going to be very, very challenging. But I would suggest that you could start it. Develop an engagement in which you begin to try to take those first steps jointly to try to understand whether or not there's an interest in the Russian side in pursuing that or moving into some kind of joint verification experiment that might advance the cause. I don't know, but I think that in this geostrategic environment that is become more complex with the rise of China, with all of the other nuclear players, by the way, most of whom are moving towards triads. This is going to be a period in which understanding that next step is going to be essential before you can do much more reducing of weapons, because if anything, the challenges are becoming greater, and we have to not only rediscover tools that we once had, but we're going to have to develop new ones. So,
Well, with
um,
that, Mr.
how does that?
You did wonderfully.
Did I answer the question?
You did, sir. We are going to have China examined by Professor Brad Thayer later in this conference. Frank Klotz is going to talk about extending New START, among other things. We want to thank you, Ron, for taking the time to come and speak with us. And on behalf of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies, the Cyber Innovation Center, and the Louisiana Tech Research Institute, I want to thank all of them for their cooperative work on this. And Ron, thank you again. We will be posting your remarks on December 10th when the conference kicks off in its live portion. But again, on behalf of all of us, thank you very much for an extraordinarily informed and very, very significant set of remarks, particularly in this day and age where we have Russia and China are serious threats, as well as emerging countries like North Korea and perhaps even Iran around the corner. So again, thank you on behalf of our sponsors and our friends. You did great, and I appreciate your help and support.
Well, Peter, stay healthy, and good luck with all your other speakers. It looks like an excellent program. I'm sorry we can't all be together and be more interactive, but given where we are, I think it's really very good that you've been doing this.
Well, thank you. Next year, we are planning to do another Triad event outside of Washington, D.C. in Crane, Indiana, which is where the Navy base is, believe it or not, near a huge amount of cornfields, where we have done 2 previously. But that's where our next Triad event outside of DC will be. But next, probably late September, will be our Minot Task Force 21 event, which we held this September. That will also be again, and hopefully we will be able to meet in person. So again, Mr. Ambassador, thank you. And on behalf of the Mitchell Institute, Cyber Innovation Center, and Louisiana Tech Research Institute, thank you all for participating and watching. And Ron, all the best to you too.
Peter, thank you. And thank you for calling me Ron. That's my preferred title.